to be all in a group, so it's like, thank God I'm not in that. And
Yeah.
We are live streaming.
ooh,
So just thought I'd warn you, you're welcome to chit chat, but in case there's anything you didn't want to share publicly.
and so that's how I made $1 million.
Using who'd have thought strippers would made that much?
Okay, I don't know if you heard, that was my palm hitting my head.
You walked right into that. You should know.
I thought it was the sound of my YouTube monetization hitting the floor.
That too, I guess.
Oh, come on, man. You're up to like $12 a month or whatever. That's like
Yeah, exactly.
all you need is a few hundred more channels and you'll be rolling in it.
All right, so I'm on the road this week, so I am kind of operating from a laptop without my multiple monitors. Are you guys seeing my slides okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you everyone for joining us again for another episode of SEO Fight Club. We have a fundamentals topic today that I want to go over, which is determining when things are Google's fault. Now, this topic is absolutely massive, and I'm just going to focus on the basics because I think that most SEOs just take the heat every time Google does something bad. And for example, I spent a lot of time in the last 3 months when Google had rendered indexing offline, helping SEOs not get fired by explaining to their clients and employers and helping them demonstrate that Google had rendered indexing offline. Now, Google could be kind. They could say, hey, world, we're going to have rendered indexing offline. And this is going to affect a lot of people, primarily people that use JavaScript to deliver content to their web applications. And until we get this fixed, Google might not recognize that JavaScript content on your website. It's not your SEO's fault. Nothing you can do about it until we, being Google, get this fixed. And if you are an SEO and you don't understand the mechanics of that rendered indexing, if you don't know to be mindful of it, here's how that same 3 months went down for you. You were doing SEO, and then all of a sudden, all of your rankings fell through the floor, and you had no idea what you did. And the engineering team said, oh, this is an SEO problem. It must be the SEO. And then the owners came to you and said, what the hell did you do? And it probably cost you that client. Maybe you got fired if it was your day job. And then that employer went to the next SEO and said, boy, was that last one a clown. And really what happened there was Google did something bad, decided to hide it, and let you take the fall. And so what I want to talk about today are some of the techniques you can use to figure out when it's Google's fault and to prove it. What do you think of that topic, Clint?
I think prove it's going to be the best part because I know a lot of SEOs that go the other route.
What's the other?
Yeah, something farts and then they're, oh, it's all Google's fault and they're doing an update. So, it's not me. It's not my SEO. It has to be Google's update. So,
yeah. Well, there are some things that are really inconclusive. Like when you get into the nitty gritty of the algorithm and, oh, my page went, down 2 spots. Was that Google or was that me? That's really nitty gritty. The stuff I'm going to talk about is going to be very definitive. But before that, let's get into some brief boilerplate. So what's on SEO this week?
Man, we need to fix this slide. I just do some rambling, no specific topic. We answer some questions and stuff. But yeah, it's mostly rambling. Next week, I'm going to go over how to write web page schema, which would be pretty interesting. Web page schema the way I do it, not web page schema the way that we're told to do it. And I think that would be an interesting topic for everybody.
Nice. So if you haven't heard of Clint's YouTube show, you've been living under a rock. It's called SEO This Week. You can find it by going to YouTube and searching for it by name. It'll be the top result. It's a really great show. Clint has a ton of street cred and is very tactical. So if you're looking for tricks, if you're looking for techniques, this is a good channel to follow. Another great show we recommend is Dre Devera's SEO Video Show. It's an interview show, and he gets in depth with the personalities in our industry. So if you want to know about all the top SEOs, how they did it, what they're doing, where they're going, this is a great way to get those stories. So likewise, you can search for it by name on YouTube. It's the SEO Video Show. And then Carolyn, what's going on with your podcast?
Well, this week, I'm actually answering a question that a listener sent in, an SEO. How do we know if we're a good SEO if all we hear from our clients is when they're not happy? So it kind of, not directly, but it sort of dovetails this topic, which I'm kind of excited about. So.
Nice. I'm looking forward to it. When can people find that new episode?
That'll be this upcoming Friday morning at 8:00 Central Standard Time.
Awesome.
I'm calling it Organic Raspberry Confidence.
And this podcast is on a lot of different platforms, so people can probably find it on their favorite platform. Is that correct?
Yes. It's Amazon, Alexa. You can listen to it in your car. It's on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, all of them.
Nice. And so I recommend this podcast. I've been binge listening to it for a while now. I'm all caught up on the episodes. They're really short, and it's the human story side of SEO. So if you're looking for more great SEO content to consume, check this one out. You can search for it in Google by name. It'll rank #1. So at IMG, there's a lot going on here. So we have our SEO test review on Thursday. So that'll be an interesting one if you're in the IMG community. We have our featured member Friday and our YouTube show roundup on Monday. And next Tuesday, we have the Ask Kyle Anything, and those are quite popular. So if you want to ask Kyle Roof all his deepest, darkest secrets, that's what that event is for. And that'll bring us to our Fight Club next week. All right, so back to our topic, determining Google's fault. So first, we have to talk about how often is it Google's fault that something's happening? And so there's this Search Engine Roundtable article that talked about how many changes Google makes in a year. And so they found that Google in 2020 had averaged 12.5 changes per day. But what they're looking at is, 4,500 changes in 2020 and 3,200 changes in both 2019 and 2018. So obviously, that's more changes than there are days. So they're doing this stuff in batches. So there are different updates. Probably the smaller ones are piecemeals, and probably the bigger related ones are going out as bigger updates. And so we've seen a lot of press around the biggest updates, the core updates. And during those updates, we tend to have a lot of difficulties in SEO. Google might suspend letting you request indexing in Google Search Console. They might simply turn that feature off if the update is big enough. Or you might find that Googlebot isn't crawling your website as frequently as it normally would. They might slow down what they're doing. You might find that you're getting crawled, but your new content isn't appearing in search as quickly as it used to. And so there are changes to the indexing. And then finally, you might find that you do or don't like, the ranking juxtaposition that happened as a result of whatever rule changes Google's been making. So there's a lot in motion here. And clearly, based on what Google is communicating, is that they're ramping up the amount of change they're bringing on. And because of that, because of all this deployment and change, there's a lot of things that can hurt SEOs that weren't caused by SEOs. And so we want to talk about those things. So any thoughts on this so far? How about you, Lee?
Hey, I figured out the unmute button. Yeah, I think this is really, really interesting because, the magnitude, just because Google makes changes, that doesn't necessarily mean that my site was impacted by, 4,500 changes. And I think, there's also just some random fluctuations. I always view like movements of plus or minus 2 positions as no movement at all, just because you see them all the time. I'm at 10, 9, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 10, 9, that sort of thing. So I think where you're headed, I like where you're headed to see, when it's a major change that causes, a massive movement in my site that it shouldn't have. So I'm really interested. I'm like Clint, I'm really interested to see how we determine it's Google's fault.
Well, let's take a look at this. This is a graphic that was part of a Google I/O presentation that came out of Google. I believe it was 2019. And what they were talking about was the second wave of indexing, that indexing wasn't a one-step process. And so what we had was there's this initial crawl where it gets your content and it'll index it based on what's in the raw source. And in SEO, we refer to this as the simple indexing. So Google got the raw HTML of the page and indexed what it found in the raw HTML. But what we find out actually happens later is they will render the page. They will render all the style sheets. They'll get all the images and the fonts, and they'll run all the JavaScript, and they'll do all of that stuff and get the final version of your web page content. And then they'll index that. And we call this phase the rendered indexing. And what we've seen lately out of the larger Google updates is that when Google does something as big as a core update, this rendered indexing either gets extremely slow or they're turning it off altogether. And we've even seen them get to a point where they say, oh, in Google Search Console, let's just deny them the ability to even request indexing. So Lee, have you had to fight with that this year?
I have to fight with indexing issues all the time. And usually when you start to see it, there are 2 trends that I've noticed. One is certainly before an update. And then I was struck by something that Kyle had said that I watched closely this year. He goes, there's a lot more indexing put on hold in the first 6 months of the year than in the second six. And, so again, we were looking at large times in the spring here where it was difficult to get pages indexed and people were complaining about it. I was like, maybe he's right. Maybe Google does a lot of the work in the first 2 quarters, so it does not impact Q4.
I don't believe that's true at all. I think SEOs have the shortest memory on earth. If you remember December of last year, Google decided to do its big updates and suspended indexing, and that was a Q4 Christmas present to all of online retail. And how quickly we forget Google did that to us. But even still, you're right. I think there is a trend, and I think Kyle was right too. There is a trend of more in Q1 and Q2 than in Q3 and Q4. But it doesn't mean that Google isn't going to screw you over for Q4. There is recent history of them destroying December. Remember, it was called the December Core Update. It's all right there in the name. And that thing was a beast. It was a beast. So many retailers were hit and couldn't get their pages updated timely. And a lot of people saw heat from that, especially if they're online retailers and their stores were built with JavaScript frameworks to fetch the content. When Google suspended this rendered indexing portion, and they said, hey, we've updated our content, let's tell Google to crawl it again, let them know we changed it. Google would do the simple indexing and look at the source, which was all JavaScript, and it wouldn't do the render, and the JavaScript had no content in it, no keywords in it. So effectively, their store had no content. And I had one online retailer, or one SEO for an online retailer, reach out to me during that. He was like, oh my God, the CEO of the company came to my desk and pointed a finger in my face and said, what the hell did you do? And that there is nothing wrong with the SEO this person did. It wasn't the SEO's choice to build an online retail shopping experience using web services and Java frameworks. That decision was above the SEO's pay grade, but yet when Google turned off that rendered indexing, it appeared to Google that their store had no keywords and all of their rankings and organic traffic fell through the floor. Now, when that happens, the correct thing to do is normally to wait, because when rendered indexing comes online, it's all going to come back later. But that SEO didn't know what the problem was. That SEO didn't know how to defend himself, because the thing that had happened was caused by Google. Google made no announcement that they were doing that, and that SEO almost got fired. I had to work with them to show him what the problem is and how to prove it to his boss and his engineering team that it wasn't anything he did, and it was the mechanics of how Google works. And ultimately, this is the code that saved his ass right here. And so this is how you detect simple rendering versus, simple indexing versus rendered indexing. So we start with a div, and we use this ARIA hidden equals true attribute because we're often dealing with websites where we don't want to read this stuff to screen readers for the visually impaired. And we use a style display equals none because we don't want to confuse people with something that's there to be a diagnostic tool. So we're hiding it, we're not reading it. First, we put a keyword in the source, just plain. And this keyword is a unique keyword that nobody in the world has ever used before, probably will never use again. And we do this because when it gets indexed, we can search for it and only this page should show up for it. So it's the easiest keyword to rank for. And when we search for this and we find this page in the search results, we know this page has been processed for simple indexing because the combination of this keyword for this URL appears in search. The indexing happened once we can find it. Now for the rendered indexing, we need to build it in a way such that the JavaScript has to execute for the keyword to appear on the page. So we break it up by using string concatenation in a JavaScript call. So that way, the combination of these strings is the keyword we want to search for. But this keyword we want to search for doesn't exist in its full form in the raw source. So the only way we get this keyword to exist in its full form is if Google runs this script and then indexes the page after combining these string fragments. And so by doing these two things, we can find out for our URL if we're getting simple indexing and if we're getting rendered index. We might get one, but not the other. And so in doing this, you can find out what's going on. And what I'm finding more and more is that whenever I update a page, not just create a page, if I like update the content, I'll update the keywords because then I can know when Google has processed the new content. New keyword gets indexed, Google's indexed that new content. It's a very powerful tool to be able to do this. And it lets you demonstrate, oh, we're getting the simple indexing, but Google isn't rendering the page yet. When we look at this in a web browser, here's what that code is doing. I've taken away the hidden divs so we can see the content. But what happens is this JavaScript command combines these four fragments into this second word. So we see the first keyword in the raw source and the rendered keyword once the page is rendered. And when Google indexes this assembled rendered keyword, then we know that the page has gotten its rendered indexing. And this is the simplest way I can think of to determine when you've gotten simple indexing and when you've gotten rendered indexing. What do you think of this technique, Clint?
I like it. I was thinking in my head, can you set the script so that's display none too? The doc write process, can that be display none too?
Oh yeah, when you have display none in the parent level div, you won't see either. Okay. It'll all be hidden. But you will be able to search for the page in Google. So it will show up in the search results, won't be visible on the page.
So this technically could be something that you could put into like a client site as part of your beginning process. In case that happens, you have this warning signal checking the rankings for your two fake keywords.
Yeah. I put this in the footer of any important page I'm trying to do diagnostics for.
Nice.
So this is a particular tool that helps us diagnose the state of Google's simple indexing and their rendered indexing. But there are other parts in this overall process that are tells of when it's Google's fault. So for example, if Google Search Console won't let you request indexing, you already know it's Google's fault because they blocked you and everyone else from requesting indexing. And so, if that is not admission of blame on getting changes indexed, I don't know what else would be, because Google doesn't have a history of announcing when they're bringing these subsystems offline. So that Google Search Console, disabling the request indexing button is about as good as you'll get out of Google today. Next, we can use our web logs diagnostically. So if you request indexing and Googlebot never visits those pages, you know that Googlebot is offline. You know that part of the processing system is either slow or disabled. Likewise, you can submit new sitemaps and Google won't work on them at times. Sometimes it's slower than others. So if you submit sitemaps and Google doesn't crawl them, you'll see that in the web logs and you'll know that sitemap processing is offline. That's also Google's fault. We saw recently on a recent episode, when we looked into Googlebot's behaviors, that Googlebot was, almost, OCD frantically pulling our RSS feeds over and over again, looking for changes. If they stop processing your RSS feeds, you know that they've paused that part of the system. And with simple indexing, I usually expect it to work in 48 hours. So it's relatively quickly. When people say they submitted something to Google and they found it in the index a couple hours later, that's generally simple indexing is what happened at that point. But when it's not working, it's hard to tell. If it doesn't work for 2 days, then I'm kind of like, all right, this isn't how it normally should be. Rendered indexing is a much slower process. So if rendered indexing doesn't happen in 5 days, I'm typically calling it offline. So, keep in mind that these processes do take time and we don't necessarily know where Google's at in the normal flow of those processes. A different type of thing that's Google's fault, but isn't really a problem, is when Google does HTML changes to the HTML of the search results. You typically discover that because a bunch of SEO tools, largely rank trackers, will break. A lot of APIs and search result processors will break. And then they get fixed and then they're up and running. Those are HTML updates. Generally, what happens when those things happen is you see all of your rankings across the board fall through the floor. But if you know to manually check in those cases, you'll see that nothing's actually changed. It's just that your rank tracker can't parse the page like it did the day before. Once the rank tracker gets updated, then all your rankings in that tool set go back to normal. But in actuality, very little, if anything, has changed at all. And then there are other subsystems that Google has, like they process images in different ways. They process news sites in a different way. They process schema in different ways. The link graph is updated in different processes. And so all these things have their own time cycles, and any one of these subsystems could be offline independently of everything else. So Lee, you've had some experience with image processing being offline. How did that affect you?
Well, it's fun because we were doing a lot of testing to look at image optimization, different types, content on the image recognition, more than just, the image name and the image alts. And, for a while it was going great. And then for a while it was just offline. You could not get Google to process, a word on an image, for example. And when that went offline, I mean, it went offline for weeks and weeks. Same thing is true with, some of the other stuff that you've seen, like, a certain schema things will work really well, and then they'll go offline and you can't get certain things indexed in those things. So, I think Google's got a lot of different data feeds that it has to utilize to, rank pages, the content on the page, the backlinks and stuff like that. And when it goes offline, I mean, it can distort your results in a hurry, because you're like, oh, I tuned all my schema and it's not working, or I tuned my images and it's not working, or I built these links and nothing happened. And it may be that it's just not processed yet.
Yep. And so there's all these different like cogs and subsystems. And when people generally want to blame Google, they want to blame Google because, oh, my web page went down 7 spots. And it's really hard to assign fault in that particular case. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we don't always have the diagnostic tools to figure out, is there something off with your page, or did Google change a rule that only affected your keyword? It's harder to tell. But in these areas that I've outlined, it's very obvious to tell, because you can see that, Google did the simple indexing but won't do the rendered indexing. You can see that Google won't allow you to request indexing. You can see in your logs that Googlebot isn't visiting the pages you've recommended via Search Console or your sitemaps or your RSS feeds. You can see that Google's not visiting those. And if you have statistics from your weblogs about how often Googlebot is visiting your pages in a given month, we've even seen data in past episodes where Googlebot will visit your pages less frequently when they kick off a big update, and then they'll play catch up and do like more work at a future date when they're trying to recover. And so even the amount of Googlebot activity could be telling as to when Google is doing something big that might impact how quickly you get indexed, or if it's possible to get indexed at the moment. And so what I'm hoping that our industry can do is start off small with just these areas. And when you see that, Googlebot isn't visiting you at the moment, when you see rendered indexing is offline, if requesting indexing is disabled, I want you to mention what it is. I want you to let the world know that this is Google's fault and they need to fix it before anyone else can do anything about it. And I want you to post about it and publish it and talk about it, because there's going to be SEOs in our industry who get fired if they don't know and understand this information. And Google is perfectly happy to not mention a thing and to let those people be fired for something that they're doing. And it's happened before. It's happened a lot in the past year. And we need to evolve. SEOs need to say, no, right now, Google sucks. Their stuff is broken and offline. And if people can, provide links to publications where experts agree that, yes, this is the case in this moment, that saves jobs. That keeps SEOs from being fired and losing clients. It allows them to send to engineering teams and executives, here's a link explaining what's happening in Google in this moment. And we need that as an industry, because we need to hold Google accountable when it's Google's fault, and SEOs suck at doing that. What do you think, Clint?
Well, I was wondering, isn't that like search engine land's job? They do such a great job of telling us what Google's doing wrong.
Well, that was sarcasm. If you didn't recognize it.
Can you refer me to the article where they said anything bad about Google, please?
And I'm on a laptop monitor, so if one of you can let me know if there are good questions. There's probably none, but if there are any questions, please let me know.
Let's see, nothing in the Zoom. Let me check the YouTubes.
Yeah, in an ideal world, we'd be holding Google's feet to the fire when their stuff doesn't work. And I think we need to try harder as an industry to hold them accountable and not let our own be blamed for the things that they do and control. And I think that's a reasonable thing to do. I actually think it's very poor ethics on Google's part to not announce when these systems are offline. They should be saying, hey, this is going to impact a bunch of you. We're sorry about it. We'll get it back up and running as soon as we can. But they're not doing that. And so we need some way that we're not being blamed when all those rankings go offline. And it had nothing to do with the SEO we did. It had everything to do with Google's update and turning off rendered indexing. It's so important. So I'm guessing that there's no questions. So I want to thank everyone for hanging out today. Let me know in the YouTube comments whether you agree, completely disagree. I got a feeling a lot of people are going to agree. If you've been in SEO long enough, you've probably lost gigs because of this. And you probably didn't know at that time that you could lose gigs for things that had nothing to do with your work. But I'm hoping that we can build techniques and educate our industry and hold Google accountable, because we need to.
There's one comment. Everyone's scared that Google may drop their rankings, so no one wants to talk about these issues.
In the white hat world, yeah, they probably think that. But, I think collectively we have a big enough voice that, Google doesn't want the PR black eye.
Yeah.
So, I think at a certain standpoint, Google's out there saying, hey, we're your friend. They go to these conferences saying, we're giving you the best advice, and we'll tell you how to pick the right SEOs who are in line with our message and beliefs. But at the same time, they're going to turn off rendered indexing, let you get fired, and pretend they don't know what you're talking about, sweep it under the rug. So are they really your friend?
Yeah.
So, if you're afraid of Google, that's okay. I think you just need to spend a bit more time and understand your relationship with Google. And that relationship probably is not a friendship if you understand it well enough.
Mm.
What do you think, Lee?
Strictly from a PR standpoint, we've thought for a while that Google has a capacity problem. It's dealing with problems of scale. And so when you have that and you have updates that are larger and larger and more pages being developed, things like that, some of these subsystems go offline for longer and longer periods of time. And if you come out publicly and say, oh, you know what, image processing is going to be off for 2 weeks, or we're only going to update the link graph quarterly or stuff like that, and questions start to get asked, maybe Wall Street loses confidence in you. So you have a PR problem. You can't admit any weaknesses, or it affects the perception of your ability to deliver growth quarter after quarter. So it's easier to say, oh, this is all planned maintenance. It doesn't affect the quality of results, move along, nothing to see here. So I think even if they said something, it would be misdirection at best.
Yep. And they have to protect their shareholders. So I get it. They're not going to do the ethical thing and tell us when their systems are badly broken. But at the same time, let's all be real and understand that they're throwing their ethics in the garbage by doing that. And because they're letting people get fired for things they do, and they're pretending like, they're sweeping it under the rug and pretending it didn't happen. So I get why they won't change, and it's all the more reason why we as an industry need to change and hold their feet to the fire. So with that, I'd like to mention one last thing. If you are a Quora user in the past or currently, and you understand Quora, and you're looking for some cutting edge advanced training, and this isn't my training, this is training that's designed and created by Lee Witcher. He has the most mind-breaking SEO course I have ever seen. It is hands down probably the best SEO course I've ever seen in my whole career. But it does require that you know the Quora tool set, at least at a fundamental level. And you should probably have your SEO basics really down, and you would ideally be a person looking to get to that next level, looking for more advanced direction. And his course is small group training. So he's only going to have like 10 or so people in his course. And it's 8 weeks of he's going to tell you exactly what to do and watch you do it to the sites you're trying to rank so that you get there. It's that type of coaching. If you're interested in that, reach out to me on Skype. It's just my name, Ted Kabaitis, at Skype. And I will make an introduction to you to Lee. He's not taking everyone. You have to apply. It's his second beta round in this training. And the people in this training have literally lost their minds about this training because it is so good. So if you're interested, let me know. You need some Quora experience to even qualify. So just know that. Thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next